So like much of the conversations on this stage today and tomorrow, we're discussing lessons that we've learned through the pandemic in this very this new remote working situation. And this session in particular, we'll be discussing co-working spaces, how they've changed in result of the pandemic, and what does this mean for an economy of a future city. So your panel now will be moderated by Pooja Agrawal, who is an architect and planner, and currently the CEO of Public Practice. So I will hand it off and enjoy.
Thanks so much, Sammy. Welcome, everyone. Such an interesting and important conversation to have. To introduce it a little bit, I think COVID has sort of fundamentally shifted the way we're using space at kind of every different scale. So right now I'm using my kitchen table as my desk. At a slightly larger scale, you can think about our neighborhoods. They've become our center of gravity. And suddenly what you can access within 15 minutes has become really, really important. And at the scale of the city, we're starting to think about what is the kind of center of a commercial city? What is the future of office space? So all of this is really going to shape the way we think about how people use the city and how we design and shape these cities as well. So even though this is very much centered around work, you can't think about work without thinking about play and life itself. So we have two incredible speakers here today to kind of push this conversation forward. Firstly, we have Ricky Burdett, and Ricky is a professor of urban studies at LSE and director of LSE Cities. He teaches in the executive MSc in Cities and co-directs the Urban Age program. Such an incredible CV. I'm not going to go through all the detail, but he has a number of board positions. He's acted as a consultant to national government, but also philanthropic agencies, and has co-edited a number of books. Ricky was appointed CBE in 2017 for his services to urban design and planning, and also awarded an honorary fellowship from the Royal College of Art in 2019. Ricky has really inspired and shaped a whole generation of us urban planners, including myself. So it's really great to share this platform with you today, Ricky. And we also have Rohan Silva. Rohan is the founder and CEO of Second Home. It's a socially responsible business that supports entrepreneurship and job creation in cities around the world. Second Home has raised over £50 million in funding from some of the world's leading investors. He also previously was the senior policy advisor to British Prime Minister David Cameron, and he worked across all areas of policy and specifically around entrepreneurship, including the angel investment tax breaks and the government's open data agenda. I think Rohan has this knack of sort of foreseeing the future, so sort of seeing trends perhaps before they're trends, or pushing our own imagination of how we can live and work and play differently. So super excited to have you on the panel as well.
Thank you.
So welcome both. We thought it would be really interesting if first Ricky and then Rohan did a kind of upfront sort of a bit of what they think about this topic. And then we'll do Q&As, and please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll bring the audience into that conversation as well. So over to you, Ricky.
Sure. Pooja, thanks very much. Rohan, great to be sharing the platform with you. It's all your fault, as you know. I think, Pooja, in terms of our cities changing as a result of the pandemic, has their role changed? The quick answer is no. I think what has actually happened is that some of the fundamental principles of what cities are about have, of course, been challenged. But what is happening today, as we speak, is beginning to return to the process of cities being all about the exchange of ideas, the exchange of goods, transactions between people, goods, and money. Of course, that's been slowed down because of the very essence of the contagion. But I think the other thing, an international audience like this one clearly needs to think about is, where are you in the world when you ask this question of what's happening to the changing role of cities? Because it's completely different whether you're in Asia or Africa or parts of the global north. I mean, if I were to imagine a world map and I were to show where cities are growing fastest, this is before the pandemic, but not that different today, you would see very large circles of concentration in Africa and Asia with something like 60, 70 people per hour moving into the Lagos, Dhaka, or elsewhere, which is, every minute and a half that the three of us are going to speak. Someone's arrived in a city and needs to be housed, needs to be fed, needs to be educated, needs to be taken care of in terms of health. So I think it's very important to take into account the geographical location, but also where you are in the economic cycle. And I think there's still a lot out there that we don't know of how COVID will hit some of the cities, particularly in poorer, more deprived areas. So that's just one very important aspect to just put out there when we talk about cities. There's no one thing as a city. All cities are incredibly different from each other. Rohan is in Los Angeles, you and I, Pooja, are in London. They could not be more different in many ways. So there are different paces of growth, and they've been affected differently by the pandemic. I guess one can start by saying, the death of cities has been greatly exaggerated. Very few of them have actually completely closed down, even though, and we'll hear this with Rohan in a moment, some areas of some cities, particularly the central business districts, have been hit very hard, while other more localized areas, let's call it the sort of town centers on the edges of the city, have done actually much better. So that says something about the metabolism of cities and how they change. But there hasn't been 180% about turn in terms of what's happened. In fact, I would say, and we can come back to this, some trends have actually been accelerated or accentuated, amplified by the pandemic in a good way, and others in a bad way. So let me pick up just one or two of those. What, of course, has become very clear to a lot of us, and particularly those who've been studying cities, the welfare of citizens, etc., is that the pandemic has hit people of different backgrounds unequally. On the whole, people living in very congested, overcrowded environments in some parts of New York, London, or of course elsewhere, have suffered more from the contagion and actually higher mortality rates in areas of extreme poverty. This is nothing new. We've known that cities are the repositories of social inclusion and exclusion. The question is, how do we actually plan and manage them? And maybe we come back to that. And of course, the other thing which has come into sharp focus is the environmental footprint of cities. We were all amazed a year or so ago when CO2 emissions in all these highly polluting cities, whether it's in China, whether it's elsewhere, suddenly came to a brutal stop. Well, obvious, isn't it? I mean, if you're not going to have anyone traveling around, that's going to drop. And the greatest risk there is that what I would call a global trend towards the denser, well-connected, highly dependent on green public transport type of city model that we've all now been talking about for a number of years was, of course, put into question. People did not want to get into congested, crowded tube trains or underground systems. If they were allowed to travel, they would either go by bike, walk, or take the private car. So how we get back to that level of, let's call it normality, is important. Very interesting that New York and London, just to take two cities, something like 45 to 50% of people are now beginning to use the tube, the buses to get to work. But over 70% in the last 2 weekends were using public transport to actually go to leisure events. I mean, there's the Euros in London, and people are using public transport around that. So I'd like to nearly end this sort of opening up of what the role of cities is by stressing the fact that their role as places that can humanize social difference or can actually deal with environmental questions and therefore tackling change are very much there. Cities consume something like 65% of global energy and pollute 75% of contribute to 75% of CO2 emissions. Therefore, a small change in those equations by reducing car dependency, by reducing sprawl and improving densification, as we call it in the trade, can only be good things. So the risk is that we lose time and cities start going in the opposite direction. I guess as someone interested in the quality of the environment, not just the nature of the cities themselves, I'm interested in the quality of design, not just of the buildings, natural light, open air. I'm obviously jealous of where Rohan is in Los Angeles, that, he can be in a permanent sort of outdoor, indoor sort of environment. We've all come to value that. And we've sort of forgotten how important public spaces, parks, and everything in between buildings is. And I think, Pooja, if I think of your role with your practice, which tries to improve the quality of design across the board in the public sector in the UK, I think planning is coming back, and urban design and planning is seen as central to social inclusion and environmental stability.
Thank you. That's a really inspiring way to end. I'm really glad to hear planning is coming back. That's very much what I advocate for. Rohan, love to hear from you now.
Well, hi, thanks so much, Pooja, and such a pleasure to be here, and following Ricky, who's an absolute hero of mine. I just wanted to really pick on the sort of shared workspace bit of the topic, and we can hopefully talk more about cities as Ricky has done afterwards. But I just want to talk about 3 ways I think that shared workspaces right now can contribute, I hope positively, to some of the big challenges we're facing as a society and an economy. One of them, as Ricky said, is to do with sustainability, environmental sustainability, and also health. We've long known that being in corporate cubicles, having gone up in a cramped elevator, and being in spaces with grey, homogeneous environments really aren't very good for us. And so when we started Second Home 7 years ago now, we made a very conscious effort to green our spaces at Second Home. Our first space in Spitalfields has 30-foot trees growing between the floors, and a couple of thousand plants inside the space. Lisbon, which we opened a couple of years later, there are something like 10 times more plants than people inside that space, which is interesting. And Holland Park, another space we've done as well. We really tried to kind of green that environment. And the reason, of course, being that as Edward O. Wilson put it, a great Harvard biologist, he was the first person ever to speak at Second Home. But as he put it, we're a biological species that co-evolved in a biological world. And of course, being around environments that draw on nature and contain nature and are part of nature are very good for us. And COVID, I think, has really prompted people in a helpful way to consider just how healthy their environment is, their workplace, their home, their way of living. And, I think what's interesting, is shared workspaces, because they bring together so many different organizations, can make a sort of outsized contribution to the city. Maybe a good example of that is what we've been doing in LA. We took a giant derelict parking car park or parking lot, as they'd say here, and a big historic building that was going to get torn down tragically. And we planted 6,500 trees and plants, brought in 700 tons of vegetation, and essentially took the office outside into nature. Now, easier to do that when the weather is as sickeningly good here as it is. But essentially exactly the same thesis as we had in London and Lisbon of integrating nature within the workplace. And what's been really interesting about it, actually, given we opened just before COVID, is that because half the campus is outdoors, because there's no recirculated air, because we already had hospital grade air filtration across the campus, because if you think about biophilic design, you think about the air we breathe as much as you think about curves and color and plants and all the rest. Actually, we've proved to be incredibly resilient to the economic impact of the pandemic, and we actually had far more people move in during COVID than before, and so on. So it's really, perhaps shows that, shared workspaces can make a big contribution on the sustainability agenda. All our spaces have always used green energy and so on, but I think really are pushing the boundaries. But also this point that Ricky made about the resilience of cities, and essentially shared workspaces are providing environments that individually small companies and teams couldn't afford for themselves. And cities at their best do that. They enable us all to do things that we couldn't do by ourselves. And I think to me, a big part of that going forward can be on sustainability, health, and well-being. A second area I think shared workspaces can make a big difference is when it comes to kind of, one of the macro challenges we face, which is, the rise of automation and, what's happening to jobs. Forgive the slightly boring slide, but, let's say 1 in 3 jobs in the UK are at risk of automation, high risk of automation. 4 in 10 in the US are, huge numbers. And, but amidst that, there's real glimmers of hope. So we know that 6% of high growth small businesses create over 60% of all the new jobs in the economy. That 6% are often known as the vital 6%. And I think shared workspaces can play an outsized role if they are deliberate about it in nurturing and catalyzing those vital 6%. So, if you take Second Home, we think a lot about the diversity of our community, not just ethnic diversity and so on, but particularly the diversity of industries within our spaces. So this is Second Home in Spitalfields. This was done pre-COVID, but we never let any one industry get above 15-20%. And we're always thinking, what industries are underrepresented, and because after all, entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial success depends on being around other types of industries, other types of companies that you can do business with and partner with and learn from. We also think a lot about slightly boring companies, law firms and investment funds and so on, that, again, a critical part of the ecosystem as you're growing your business. And then the final thing on this sort of entrepreneurship agenda is that it's really hard. As I found over the last few years, compared to, in truth, working in number 10, starting a business is just so much harder. And so we run a really great education program. This is the founder of Deliveroo. The guy on the right is the founder of Farfetch, all designed to kind of give entrepreneurs the skills they need and insights they need to grow, and inspiration. And I think what's cool is that, these two guys are a good example, I think, of that impact. So Amit on the left, Hayden on the right, quit their boring jobs as management consultants and started a green energy company called Bulb out of the ground floor of our Spitalfields space, just the two of them. We, through our kind of community, introduced them to investors, PR firms, lawyers, recruiters, and so on. And they grew from the two of them to 350 employees within Second Home over the course of about 3 years. And when they left us, they had 350 employees. So that kind of exponential growth, really can't, is very hard to pull off, I think, outside of these kinds of tight clusters. And, shared workspaces can be truly catalytic. And in fact, we found in London, teams based at Second Home in London have created jobs 10 times faster than the national average. So, really great impact. It doesn't happen by accident, but, when it does happen, and when you create the right conditions, it can really be a great impact. And the final of the third ways I think shared workspaces can make a contribution right now is to do with the question of innovation and creativity. And part of the way in which we can win the race against the machine is by unlocking creativity, because luckily the machines aren't so good at that. And there's places like Building 20, which was a building at MIT, out of which came the atomic clock and the first video games and universal grammar. Places where over the years, lots of different types of people and researchers all collided and great innovations happened. Bose Corporation, for example, started out of that building. And today, if you go to campuses like the MIT campus, you see this kind of idea of bringing together different types of of researcher, and so Second Home, one of the ways we do that, obviously, is the diversity of the community, but also our cultural program, which is all open to the public, tables lift out the way and things, and we have music and people like Stella McCartney and Martha Lane Fox and Sadiq Khan, David Lynch, and so on. And it's really all about trying to give people the inspiration and learning they need to have a sort of new idea. And this question of where creativity comes from is, I think, increasingly becoming a kind of macroeconomic imperative for cities. And again, I think shared workspaces can play a really significant role there. And critically, I think having had that creative collision be an environment in which you're more likely to be able to turn that into a job or a business or a product, which is I think just going to be so important as the economy recovers post-COVID. So that's all from me, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting when you're talking about the shared workspace. It just made me think that somehow that's almost like a microcosm of the city. That what makes these exciting, interesting places is that kind of exchange of knowledge, the creativity, the innovation, the density of people working there. And that's very much how, I suppose, Ricky was talking about the city itself. One of the things Ricky mentioned that, some trends have been accentuated through COVID in a good or bad way. And I'd like to hear a bit from both of you about just sort of building on that point. What do you think has perhaps been a bit negative, or what's been positive, and how is that going to shift as we move forward?
Well, one of the things which is interesting, right at the beginning of the pandemic, sort of just over a year ago, there was this immediate knee-jerk reaction that density, that people being close together, is dangerous and bad for you. The reality is that actually some of the most dense, advanced urban economies of the world, and I'm thinking of Singapore, Hong Kong, Taipei, Seoul, actually responded and were able to deal with the COVID crisis much more efficiently, simply because the distribution of services, health centers, doctors, hospitals themselves, were in a way closer to the high percentage of the population. Of course, that is not the case, let's say, in the current crisis as it's hit India, which is still a rural and highly dispersed population across this vast and wonderful country. The point here, Pooja, is that actually the ability to design, plan, and govern a more condensed city, better planned, with better public spaces, with better services, and most importantly, and this is something that Rohan, it's the other side of the coin of what Rohan has been talking about, providing housing in such a way that young people can live there, because you can have lots of second homes and it's wonderful, but if you can't live anywhere near them, because you can't afford to, the model really begins to fall apart. So if you add, Pooja, to the dense mixed-use type model, good public transport and affordable housing, that's a trend, I would say, that has been amplified, or the need, the public discussion about that has been amplified by the COVID crisis. It hasn't actually gone away. Just out of interest, I was in what is known as a House of Parliament Government Select Committee the other day about the future of the High Street. I was one of the 3 or 4 experts asked. And there was a very, very serious comment from one of the MPs, which said something like, we wonder whether allowing free parking in the city and stopping any housing at all being built in sort of these central areas of cities would revivify, bring high streets back into life. Of course, both of those two would add yet another dagger in the back of sort of the high street rather than the opposite. So maybe those are issues that one needs to reflect on together when we think about how cities are responding to in a strong way to the challenges posed by the pandemic.
And I think the point of high streets is really interesting. I suppose people have always had the sort of assumption that high streets are for retail and primarily retail, but increasingly even COVID has showed how important a high street is just for that kind of social contact. And Rohan, I was wondering what you think about that sort of, what's interesting about a lot of the second homes in London, for example, have not historically been in the center of the city, as it were. You were already kind of building on this idea that actually people don't want to be traveling on a busy tube to get to Canary Wharf. So yeah, is that something you are seeing in other cities as well?
Yeah, I mean, why is Lisbon? We opened in Lisbon in 2016. We made a decision to go there in 2015. Big part of the attraction of that city is it's such a walkable city, and I think even LA, for all the grim reality of 6, 8, 10 lane freeways and things, it's actually in the sort of, it's London-esque in that it's a collection of villages, really. And so they can be very walkable within those areas. I think, to me, it's as Ricky says, absolutely about affordability of housing as the kind of absolute macro challenge for cities. But also, I think when it comes to sort of livability, there are obviously other things as well. So access to childcare, both RLA and London Fields second homes have childcare within the spaces. How is that distributed through the city? If you're having to sort of travel one way to go to work, and got to go another way to access childcare or education, big challenge. So can that all be situated kind of locally? Really fantastic, really important, agenda for the city. And then I think also the livability is also bound up in things like music venues, bars, that sort of the culture of cities. And I think certainly if you take somewhere like London, that we've sort of gone really the wrong way over the last 10 years. And perhaps that we'll see a rejuvenation post lockdown. The tragedy of so many places potentially closing is that maybe new things can emerge. But it certainly is a sort of axis on which cities like London have sort of gone in the wrong direction. Places like Lisbon are really on the up, and so I think that competition between cities feels like it's really becoming more profound. Hopefully that will prompt policymakers to kind of head in the right direction on a bunch of issues that we've known for a long time are incredibly important. And perhaps in a lot of ways COVID has been a bit of a catalyst for things that were going to happen anyway, but perhaps sort of speeded up that process.
Thank you.
Maybe if I could just add, Pooja, so, I mean,
Sure.
the thing that Rohan and I have talked about separately, but we should remind ourselves now, is that the sort of pattern of commuting or the choice that you might have to work in the sorts of spaces that you're describing is not for everybody, right? And you rightly mentioned, Rohan, the importance of, say, cultural and art, music, and other activities. The whole hospitality sector of any of these global cities is dependent on people not sitting and Zooming, but actually commuting those long hours often. And I think balancing all those aspects needs to be put back into the picture. I fear that the debate has been slightly colonized, maybe by people like us, but not only, who look at a sort of niche cross-section of actually who is the user of the city, while it's a far more complex, far more messy, far more organic process. And that's where the concepts of someone like Richard Sennett of the open city actually mirrors, as Pooja, what you were saying, Rohan's point about the open office in many ways. And I think we need to keep those ideas in our mind as a sort of fundamental requirement of democratic urban society.
I really encourage the audience to ask questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I was thinking, as you're talking about the sort of social equality and the access to the city and so forth, the word quality was used a couple of times, and the quality of life, and also, I suppose, the quality of design. I think often design is seen as quite an elitist concept, while fundamentally, when we talk about health and well-being, it's such a it should be a fundamental right. So actually, Rohan, do you want to start by thinking, like, just talking through how design has played a really important part to the way you've sort of created your workspaces?
Yeah, I mean, so, we work with architects who were architects in residence at MIT in Boston, and the reason they were there is they think a lot about, slightly highfalutin things like evolutionary psychology and terms like biophilia, which are sort of very fancy ways of simply saying that, of course, we feel better when we are around nature because we evolved in natural environments over many years. But our cities don't really resemble, and our workplaces and so on don't really resemble the kind of environments we evolved in. If you think about a typical office building in London, it's kind of grey, it's box, everything inside it is homogenous. We didn't evolve in environments like that. We evolved in environments full of complexity and diversity and colour. There are no straight lines in nature, and so design can have a profound effect on your well-being through that connection with nature. But not just that, as Ricky was saying as well, the way a space is designed can have a massive impact on the way we interact within that space. And lots of these soulless corporate developments and so on, they're not places where people congregate. In fact, they're sort of designed not to be places where people congregate. And there's also something about the sheer scale of lots of developments. Take London. They're just too big, these developments. They're inhuman in terms of their scale. And you see it. Look at what's happening. Canada Water, Busto, and these developments they're just too big. And that is a very alienating thing in the city, for things to be completely out of scale, something to be just dropped out of the sky rather than sort of iterated and grown kind of more organically, which is the way that London grew up and great cities grew. So there's something that's very inhuman that's happening, and that, I think, is a challenge for all of us. It's not an elitist thing, and in fact the elites can move. If you look at what privileged young people are doing, people who've got lucky enough to have had a good education and so on, they're leaving places like London because they can. So the people who are left behind are often the ones who can't move. And so I think it's, to me, it's the, exactly as you're saying, Pooja, the opposite of an elitist issue. It's absolutely something that affects, the poorest and the least well-off hardest.
Absolutely. And I think this is where, the work I do, I see how important the role of government is, and planning and policy. And so often planning is given such a negative connotation. So Ricky, you sort of touched on this earlier, that planning is coming back. It would be really interesting for you to sort of tell the public sector what more should they be doing and thinking about as we move to thinking about the future of cities.
Sure. I think that let me slightly disagree with your previous introduction or comment to Rohan about design being elite. It's not. Often the way it's talked about may be unapproachable, but if, and this is coming to your point about governance, if one considers the design of a street, right, the pavement, a bench, not to mention where a tree might be, the lamppost, right? At that sort of scale, many cities, not all cities, particularly those who maybe have a budget, do and have historically prioritized the design of the public realm. And I think of the paving slabs of Barcelona, or the beautiful landscaped paving of Burle Marx, the great landscape architect in Copacabana. One of the most democratic sort of stretches of urban waterfront anywhere in the world. Beautifully designed, not expensively designed. I think that's part of it. Now that leads directly to your question, Pooja, about governance. Who decides? Who prioritizes in a city government, at a level of a community, or even national government, that these things matter, right? And I think here, it may be too easy to say it, but having someone who is directly elected, he or she can be thrown out after 4 or 5 years, who actually sets a vision for the city and can do something about it. In other words, a mayor, is something that actually makes a hell of a difference in terms of determining some of these choices. And I think, Rohan's worked in central government. It sometimes is just too distant from some of the decisions that are made on the ground. And of course, the local community, highly important, will nearly by definition end up to a degree of NIMBYism. Not in my backyard. No, we don't want that there. I would finish this comment about design to say that we've all alluded to it, that the pressures of being stuck inside over the last year, wherever we are in the world, have made the outside more important to us. Now, that means either the terrace, the courtyard, or the park. And I think putting back value into that and recognizing that as worthy of investment, and that's where our tax dollars should go, could be one of these important, unexpected, longer-term effects of this current crisis.
I completely agree, and that's what I think of as good design, and is these democratic public spaces that are inclusive and everyone can feel like they can spend time there. So just to finish up, Rohan, having worked in sort of national government and that kind of policy space, what I'm sure you have found yourself sort of fighting regulations and having sort of barriers. So how does government sort of catch up in a way with what you're trying to do, with what people are trying to do on the ground?
Well, I think, so from my experience, other people may have others, I found that, why are we in LA? I mean, we found the planning system in London to be, well, the UK, I guess, but, so fundamentally restrictive to what we consider to be good, innovative design. I mean, the first question in every planning meeting I've ever been in, the first question from the planners has always been, what's the precedent for this design? And if you're trying to do something new, there isn't a precedent. What they really mean is show us another building that looks just like this. And very different to Los Angeles, where there are really strict government regulations, as there should be, about health and safety, fire safety, earthquake safety being Los Angeles, and so on. Really strict. And they inspect you, the government inspects you at every step of the construction process. Much, much stricter than London on safety. But they don't have anything to say about how the building looks, unless you're in a conservation area or whatever. And neither should bureaucrats really have a view about how something looks, in my view. And I know that's contentious, but I think the job of a planner is to make sure that something is safe, fits within a wider agenda for the city. But, many of you think about our spaces. So just 2 quick examples. Middlefields, we planted 8 fruit trees in front of that building. Good for biodiversity, each one a different species to help pollinators. The local council there told us, the planning department revoked our planning permission or withdrew it because we said we were going to plant 8 fruit trees. And when we asked why, they said it's our policy, it's our view that fruit trees make a mess, right? So that is because of plums falling on the pavement and things like that. Another example of that being in London Fields, which is the project that means we're not going to come back to London, I think, for a long time. But we're putting childcare in that space, and because we had a cafe with an alcohol license, a cultural venue, a little bookshop, a workspace, as well as childcare. It took us 2 years to get approval from the council. 2 years, and this is a space that pays a living wage, that's open to the public, an events program that's open to the public. It's a place that hosts education events for refugees and asylum seekers and so on. And it took us 2 years. It almost killed our business because we were paying rent for that whole 2-year period that we weren't allowed to be open because of the council. So, you know, that has a profound sort of choking effect on innovation and new things. I mean, to the extent that we've spent $20-30 million in or £20 million in Los Angeles on our campus. That could have been 4 new sites in London. You know, we're not planning to come back and do anything else in London, you know, unless there's a real change in that agenda. And that's not you know, I just have a little business to run. I have to kind of go where I hope we can have an impact and be sustainable. So, you know, it does have an effect. And there's lots of others like me who, you know, lots of great architects do their best work away from the UK. That's just, we've known that for 50 years.
Yeah. So I've got we basically sadly have to wrap up, but just sort of trying to bring all of these things together, especially on that note. There's something around, there just seems to be so many different silos, whether it's the entrepreneurs versus government versus, you know, people actually need to be working a bit more closely together and it not be seen as such a kind of us versus them situation, I think, and we do need to kind of keep, like, cities, as has been said, like that's kind of how Ricky started up. They are these almost like organisms and specimens that change over time, and there's these cycles that come and go, and how we all sort of adapt and respond to that and be kind of nimble and on our feet, whether it's government, whether it's entrepreneurs, whether it's our educational institutions. It's really, we should be all talking to each other more and sort of working together more to solve these really fundamental crises as we look ahead of, you know, the environment and sustainability, or, you know, social equity and the health crisis. So thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. So I've definitely been left with lots of things to think about and want to ring you all later and try and solve the world together. So thank you so much for your time.